All right, everybody. The Boston Celtics are up 3-0 in the NBA Finals. Game 4 to close it out coming up in Dallas, Texas tomorrow night. Here to help us get set for what could be a coronation special, we got our guy Brian Barrett from The Ringer, and the Off the Pike podcast is here. Let's stop messing around. This is Green with Envy. Let's lock in. What up, what up, what up? Welcome into another edition of Green with Envy, an NBA Finals edition. It is another Thursday live stream here. Proud to bring you here an NBA Finals preview of Game 4, where potentially the Celtics are bringing home banner 18. This is your boy, Will Weir, checking in. How you doing? How you living? Of course, you know I got my best friend, co-host, and the coach of our podcast, Greg Manakis, here with me. And today we have a special guest from TheRinger.com, from the Off the Pike podcast. It's Brian Barrett. Brian, thanks for being here, man.
Thanks for having me, guys. One win away from banner 18. Can't think of a better time to hop on here with you guys. That was a ton of fun last night, and hopefully Thursday is just the final piece to the puzzle and the Celtics finish him off, because the series is over. But let's just I'd like to see another game at the Garden. That'd be fun, but I'd be very happy with a sweep. And what that would mean for this team historically, they'd be one of the best Celtics teams of all time. We haven't really seen a lot of NBA teams go through the playoffs with only 2 losses. I mean, most recently we had that Warriors team that lost 1 game to the Cavs. Then you have to go back to the Shaq and Kobe Lakers. So to have 2 losses and win a championship, I don't care what the road is pretty impressive.
Yeah, Brian, can't lie, man. Obviously, we talked about this before. We went live here, Greg and I, here in Austin, Texas. We're driving up to Dallas tomorrow for Game 4. So we're definitely looking for potentially the Celtics to get that sweep. And it feels nice. If the Celtics were to wrap this up Friday night, 80-20, just has a really nice ring to it, a nice round, 100-game total, 80-20, 80% of your games that, you know, you won throughout the season, just makes it super clean. But I want to start here, Brian. You tweeted out partly after the game last night, some of it was today, a whole bunch of different stats that really are starting to pile up and define this series. You know, I'm curious to you, and you can use either a stat from this series or maybe it's a stat throughout this, as you talked about, historic playoff run for the Celtics. Which one do you think, if you had to pick one that you think is the most impactful or meaningful, which statistic do you think it is?
Well, I think it's something that Joe Mazzulla now has been talking about for the past 2 years since he's taken over the job, which are the threes, right? Because it is an indicator of 2 different things. So I'll run through them first, and then I'll explain what I mean by that. If you look at the makes in this series, the Celtics 43 compared to the Mavs at 22. So they have a 63-point advantage in 3-pointers. If you look at attempts, it's 127-78. Catch and shoot threes, which of course you want a lot of those. The Celtics have 33. The Mavericks have 9 catch and shoot made threes in the entire series, right? So the Celtics are plus 72 there. And then you look at the corner threes, 18 made corner threes for the Celtics, and then 5 for the Mavericks. 5. This is the team that was number 2 in the playoffs, and really number 1 in the playoffs because the Pelicans lost in the first round in corner threes made. So the Celtics are plus 39. And then the other thing that goes along with this is Luka as the primary defender. They got him for 28 in Game 3. They got him for 19 in Game 2. They got him for 23 in Game 1. So what the Celtics have done is they're completely dominating the math game on the defensive end, because they're saying, hey, guys, we're fine with Hauser switching on to Luka. We're fine with Al switching on to Luka, because what we don't want is Luka getting into the paint and kicking it out and spraying it out to open shooters. Like, if you're Oklahoma City right now, you're like, oh, what about PJ Washington? Why did we leave? What happened with, like, maybe that was a bad strategy, right? And then on the flip side, the Celtics, it's just so unique how they're attacking, right? Where Tatum had the most drives he's ever had in a game, 29 in Game 2. And what's happening is it's not even sometimes the first drive, right? It's the second drive where he kicks it out to Jalen. Jalen gets in the paint. He kicks it out to an open shooter. So it's this emphasis that Mazzulla has had for the past 2 years where we want to constantly win the math game. And we want to force our opponents to take tough twos. You look at the numbers from last night. Kyrie and Luka took a ton of twos in between the restricted area and the three-point line. We don't want you taking layups. If you're a bad shooter, we'll let you shoot. And we've seen that throughout the first couple of rounds of the playoffs into this round. But it's just, I was hesitant at times with Missoula, never about the threes. I always thought the philosophy was, it made a lot of sense, right? You want to take more threes. The one, like at times I was like, last year against Philly, why are we waiting until game 6 to get Robert Williams in the starting lineup when Tucker's on the floor? That's when you want him on the court. But man, he's made me a believer. And the other thing that this does, guys, you look at their numbers, transition defense, they've been the best in the league this season, and they've been the best in the playoffs. And the reason for that is like their spacing is so good, because that's the thing that I was always confused about. When Missoula would always say, they would talk about games where they would have bad defensive performance, and he said, well, a lot of it has to do with his offense. And when he first started saying this, I'm like, what is this guy talking about? He's insane. Look at the defense. It's like, oh, well, the spacing's bad, right? You take a bad 2, or you go to ISO hero ball and you take a bad shot. So many times the Celtics big, whether it is Porzingis or Horford, they're at the wing, right? So those guys are getting back in transition. And that's why the Celtics, you look at, they've dug into offensive rebounding this season, right? And where they do that is from the corner. Like a rare crash last night from Hauser from the free throw line. But other than that, they crashed from the corners, right? Because that's not going to affect your transition defense. So I think the 3-point, that this is the most analytically driven team in the history of the NBA, more so than any Mike D'Antoni, Daryl Morey team. And it's completely worked for the Celtics team, because the other thing is this, they don't foul. You can't get free throws against them.
Yeah, man, the game plan discipline for the Celtics in this series especially has been really, really impressive. You mentioned the corner 3 discrepancy between what the Celtics are shooting and what the Mavs are shooting, just in sheer number of attempts. And last night, the Celtics gave the Mavs more openings, and I think the Mavs realized that they had. Like Derrick Jones Jr. did not want to shoot the ball when he was open. PJ finally figured it out in the fourth quarter that he had to make himself a threat. I was texting my brother during the game, and I was like, dude, if the other Mavs don't start trying to create for themselves and take it upon themselves to do something, they're going to lose this game. And that's what happened in the fourth quarter. Kyrie and Luka didn't go crazy in the fourth quarter. It's just other guys stepped up. PJ had a couple buckets. Josh Green had a couple buckets. We double team Kyrie and Luka fouls out. Derek Lively gets a couple dunks at the rim, right? And it felt like the Mavs didn't figure out that there were openings until it was too late in that game. Another thing that you mentioned was the spacing. And one thing that I've really loved just overall big picture with the Celtics offense and with Missoula, they love going to that empty side action with the slot 5. So, they have Derek White on one side, Tatum or Brown comes and sets the screen, and they have Horford or Porzingis on the other side of the court in the slot. And that, that's great for transition defense, but that is such a weapon because it takes the low man, right, who's normally a big guy, and brings him up onto the elbow versus on the baseline where you can help out. So they're doing all these little things that have unlocked their offense to the point where they're almost impossible to guard when they play the right way. And they play the right way for a majority of the game, save for that 8-minute stretch in the fourth quarter where things kind of went to shit.
It's part of Celtics basketball. It's how it goes.
Yeah, you knew that was coming. And I do wonder at some point, Missoula is such a math guy that I wonder if, they go to this prevent offense sometimes that's sort of aggravating, because I think he's doing the math where it's like, hey, if we use most of the shot clock, there's no way they can come back and win the game, even if we only score on this amount of possessions. Mm-hmm. They usually do that with 5 minutes left. I felt like at times last night they did that way too early.
Started with 10 minutes in the fourth quarter.
And it was Pritchard's taking these contested mid-rangers. I was angry at the time. I tweeted out, get Pritchard out of the game. It was probably too harsh on Pritchard. I was just like, what are we doing here? This is not how they ended up getting the lead, right? So I think some of it, maybe that had, and some of it's human nature too. But I think the most impressive thing is they ended up winning that game, right? In the past, they probably end up losing that game. And I think the biggest shot of the Tatum Brown era was Jalen hitting that 20-footer to put them up 4, because that possession was going nowhere. Jalen's just like, hey, guys, why don't you hop on my back right now? I'm going to hit this shot. And it was just a dagger. And then, of course, you had the Al turnover. I don't know what he was doing. He felt like he
Hey, last 2-minute report came out. It was a foul. Let's just throw that out there. But
okay.
Yeah, it came out. But I'm with you. I don't know what the hell he was doing.
Yeah, so he just like goes to nowhere, but then he gets the stop on Kyrie, and I don't know what Kyrie was doing. Like Kyrie has to get that shot up quicker. He waited way too long. He didn't take it, I don't think, until like 25 seconds left in the game. So that was sort of perplexing to me. But I've been awfully impressed with Jalen throughout this run. I think Tatum has sort of been too harshly criticized, I guess, for lack of a better term. Obviously, he didn't shoot the ball well in game 2. There's no real defending that. He took a bad step back late in that game as well. But I think one of the things that goes under the radar with Tatum, like when we're talking about the whole how great Jalen's been, is like Jalen can't be this good without Tatum. Like nobody's putting their best perimeter defender on Jaylen Brown. They're putting, and this is not to take away from Jaylen Brown because the guy's he just tied Larry Bird for 8 straight games, right? Dick Lipe tweeted out last night, 8 straight games over 20 points and 50% from the field, which is just amazing. But what Tatum has done throughout this series, like you have to give him credit for sort of taking over that playmaking role. I don't know if you guys agree with this, but I feel like in this series in particular, this is the most he's been sort of like the primary playmaker throughout the season. Like one thing we haven't really seen, and I think it's more about the Celtics are going after Luka a lot more than Kyrie. I thought coming into the series, we get a ton of that stuff where they use Kyrie's man as the roller. Like they did it all the time with, or it's Kyrie's man as the screener. They did it all the time during the season, that inverted pick and roll, Derek White screening for Tatum. Maybe part of that is because Kyrie's usually on Drew. Maybe that's part of it, but I feel like they've played differently in this series. And going back to what Greg said, just like the game plan discipline. I mean, it's very difficult it's easy for a coach to say, you know what, guys, we're not switching on Luka and Kyrie. And then seeing what Luka and Kyrie just in this game 3, but Luka early on in the series have done in some of these first quarters to say, no, we're fine. You guys, we're fine. That's why I looked at this, like it's 51-50 at halftime, right? And you look at it and you're like, well, the Celtics are 9 of 27 from 3. The Mavericks are hitting a lot of difficult 2s. They had hit 5 threes at that point, and 4 of them were Kyrie. You're like, the Mavericks are not generating good shots. The Celtics are. This is going to turn around. And arguably that third quarter is the best that the Celtics have played this entire season. That may be hyperbolic, but in terms of what was on the line, that was probably their best quarter.
Yeah, I mean, I think you look at game 2 and game 3, where, game 2, the Celtics didn't shoot the ball as a team. Specifically, Tatum didn't shoot the ball well, and they still had a 3-point lead at halftime. And you're like, this feels like trouble for the Mavs. And then same thing. And then Luka was going off in that first half of game 2. And then in game 3, same thing, where you're like, all right, Celtics are only down 1, despite, it's mostly Tatum. And you can make an argument that maybe Tillman and Hauser were the next second and third best players in that first half for the Celtics. Like, these things are not adding up for the Mavericks right now. And I want to go back to Jaylen Brown here for a minute because, Greg and I were chatting for a minute before you hopped on here, Brian, about how we really want to kind of do a deep dive into Jaylen Brown at some point this offseason, because the path that he's taken in his career with the Celtics, it's really astonishing. And I think over the last few years, one of the things that Greg and I have really preached on is that every year Jaylen Brown comes back with something about his game that is better. Whether you go back several years and it was shooting, another year it's going to be, his defense, or it's going to be rebounding. And I look at this year, and obviously we've talked a lot about him and Tatum sacrificing some of their point totals, because now you have Porzingis, you have Drew Holiday, Derek White's taken a leap, and so they've taken that step back. But I think with Jaylen, and it's on full display right now throughout this postseason, I think he's been the most consistent Celtic from start of the postseason all the way through until where we're at today, where he's now, crazy enough, the finals MVP favorite. Like, I mean, just think about how nuts that is, that Jaylen Brown is likely going to be the finals MVP here. And tell me if you agree with this. I think the 2 things that he's really improved upon the most for this season have been his leadership, which I think you're seeing a little bit, and that was baked into the Marcus Smart trade, because we didn't know we were getting Drew Holiday, right? So baked into that is the Jays, we got to put it on them. They have to be the leaders. I think you're seeing that with both of them, but specifically with Jaylen, you're getting some of those great mic'd up segments. You're seeing it in his approach to the game. And then I think his on-court patience has been the other part that has really developed. And last night, he has a 30-point, 8 rebound, 8 assist game. And, you mentioned like a little bit of a slow start in that first half. He still had 5 assists. That's very un-Jaylen Brown, like to have 5 assists and a half. And for him to finish with that 30-point, 8 rebound, 8 assist line, the overall game, to me, a lot of that is in the patience that he has, and not just knowing that he has to have blinders on at all times. have those been things that you've seen with Jaylen as well? And is there anything else that you would add on about what you've seen from the growth of Jaylen Brown?
Yeah, I agree with both those. And I totally agree with what you said about the first half. Is he was 0 of 3 from deep, but I thought he really was playing well, especially getting the ball to Tatum. You look at his assist numbers in that game. You mentioned the 8. It's a playoff career high. He had already had 7 twice in this postseason run, so his playmaking has clearly been better. He had 21 assist points. He had 30 points, and he had 21 assist points. He had 4 assists to Jason Tatum. So, and the leadership stuff has been awesome. And I'll add, like, the press conference, Jaylen has been pretty funny too. And even after the game last night, he's on the court being interviewed rather by Lisa Salters. And she asked him, like, how did you guys hold off that Kyrie performance? And he said, well, that was a vintage Kyrie performance. It just wasn't enough. And I don't think he meant it to like troll Kyrie, but I'm like, this is awesome. Like, I can't believe he just said that. But the leadership, I do feel like it was time to move on from Smart. And it just so happened that you got Porzingis. But look, we could be criticizing the Porzingis move right now if it isn't for the fact that Drew Holiday became available, right? Because you think about this playoff run where Porzingis, I think he's probably the first guy in NBA history, I don't know this for a fact, to only play in the first round of the NBA Finals in his playoff career. Like, I can't imagine anybody else has ever done that. But I would say, just circling back to Jaylen, is he started doing this last year, but his ability to just live in the paint. He's 7th right now in points in the paint. And when you have this team that is so good with their ability to generate threes, you need at least somebody that can be the hammer and get into the lane, right? And I know those aren't the most efficient shots, but think about it. Jaylen's an incredible tough shot maker, and he's only getting better when it comes to that, right? Like his 2-point shooting has been great the past couple of seasons. And when you needed it and when you couldn't hit a 3, he was able to do that. But the biggest improvement to me out of all the stuff that he's done is his defense. He said it before the season. He wants to be a better defensive player. And Jaylen still, like, if he's off ball, we saw it in that game too. He got back cut by Luka. Off ball, he can get a little spacey. But I think where this started was last year when he took on the James Harden matchup, and he was really good against James Harden. And then you come back this season, how many different type of guys has he covered? I mean, remember the game where the Warriors left him wide open? And that game, he was covering Curry to start the game. And he said after the game that he's 6'7", or he didn't say his height, but he said he's 240 pounds chasing around Steph Curry. I'm like, wait, he's 240 pounds? I checked in with somebody. They're like, yeah, that's accurate. And I'm like, well, I knew he's jacked, but they're like, yeah, huge lower body too. Like, it's not just like he looks like a superhero out there. But you think about it throughout this playoff run, the fact that we knew he was taking on the Luka matchup. I couldn't believe that everybody's talking about this. Like, oh, it's going to be Drew. I'm like, what are you talking about? They've put Jaylen on him throughout the season, right? So I think that to me is the most, and that's part of his leadership, right? And it works perfectly because Tatum he can be a great on-ball defender. We saw what he did to Kevin Durant a couple of years ago, held him to 3 of 18 shooting in that series against Brooklyn, right? But he's better off the ball, right? As a playmaker, as a help defender, he can block shots. And one of the underrated parts about Tatum is he's guarding centers in the series. Like, the reason you're taking away their bread and butter play is because Tatum can switch on to Luka, even if Luka's got him a couple of times. But Jaylen's a much better on-ball defender than he is an off-ball defender. So I think that synergy has been perfect. But to me, the playmaking for sure, the leadership for sure, and then the defense. And I didn't know if he had another gear. Like, he just keeps getting better every year. I thought he was probably done growing as a player, right? When you get to a certain age, but he continues to add things to his game.
Yeah, he's definitely entering his prime. You mentioned the Warriors game. How crazy does it seem now at this point that Jaylen Brown is about to be the finals MVP, and just 3 to 4 months earlier, the Warriors' whole game plan was, fuck it, let's just make Jaylen Brown shoot, see if he beats us. Like, the growth that he's gone through this season is unbelievable. I did want to bring up, have you listened to Bill's pod with Doc Rivers yet?
Yeah.
Okay, so there was one really good part of that pod that I liked when they were talking about Paul Pierce and how Paul always knew that, like, where his spots were, right? Doc Rivers brought that up about Paul being a good shooter and how he always was able to get to his spots. And that's one thing, to your point, Will, you mentioned Jaylen's patience. And I think part of the patience is just understanding, now that his handle's tighter, his body's stronger, he can fend off people with either arm. He just gets to his spots whenever he wants. There's really nobody in the league that can keep him out of his spots. And Brian, I know you love that 20-footer to the nail in the coffin shot at the end of the game. that was a classic Jaylen Brown getting to his spot, right? He goes high pick and roll. For some reason, Jason Kidd has Tim Hardaway Jr. out on the court, and the Celtics hunted him in the last 4 minutes when Luka was out of the game. Jaylen goes right at Tim Hardaway Jr., hard dribble to his right. Everyone's expecting Jaylen to go right. Tween cross, one dribble, shot fake, get somebody up in the air, and hit the jumper very patiently, very DeMar DeRozan-esque, just in his ability to work in the mid-range now. People are overreacting to that shot fake, and Jaylen is getting them to pull their hands back because he's gotten so good at leaning in for the foul. He's gotten so good at that little Kevin McHale step through. Jaylen Brown is just getting to the spots that elite players get to, and you need to get to in big moments. And it's crazy to see, man, because he's always been a good mid-range shooter, but the polish on his game is just so refined.
Yeah, and I think you need one guy that can at least score from that in-between area, even in the Celtics offense, that the reason it's so good is they're so analytically driven. And look, the other thing I'd say too, I know I gave Mazzulla a ton of credit and he deserves it, is you need the personnel. Not every team can defend, right, the Mavericks the way the Celtics are defending.
Shout out to Brad Stevens.
Yeah, unbelievable. I mean, how about even Tillman? I mean, last night, like, you think about that as sort of like an afterthought of the trading deadline. Tillman goes in there, he stones Luka like 3 times, had a stop on Kyrie. And I don't know about you guys, but when that corner 3 went up, I'm like, I don't know if this thing's going in. It didn't look good. And somehow it goes in. I'm like, oh,
man. His entire body is fading to the left.
We talked about that in our post-game show. Just like, why? There's no one around him. Why is he fading so far over to the left right now?
Yeah, he doesn't even look like a basketball player at all. But getting back, sorry, I'm on a complete digression here. But yeah, Jaylen's the one guy in this team where if you go back like recent history of NBA champions and you look at even that Warriors team, right? They needed like a phenomenal ISO score to beat the Cavs, right? In terms of they lose in 16, and that Cavaliers team was awesome. And they forced the Warriors to play, and they've had that beautiful game the Warriors did where they're always leading the league at assists, and they needed an ISO guy. So it was Kevin Durant, and Durant got to his mid-range game. You get to 2019, you look at that Raptors team, and I know we can say, hey, all the injuries to Golden State, but Kawhi gets to that mid-range area. Jaylen's the guy that does it for the Celtics, and he's been so good in terms of hitting those shots. He even has that little floater game at times. That step through, too, that you mentioned. I always think it's a travel. I'm like, how is this possible that he gets that much space? It's ridiculous. But I think part of it, too, is just the fear of him getting downhill because you have to respect him as a driver. So when he pulls back for that, it's like he's getting really an open opportunity there. And his follow-away game, too. Like the arc that he puts on those follow-away jumpers that he takes has been ridiculous. But yeah, that's a great point. Like the Pierce comparison is perfect that Doc brought up as well, where that whole Doc Pierce thing was funny too, where he's like, hey, Paul, do you think you're a bad shooter? I guess he said that, where it's like, hey, you're shooting 40%. How could you be a good shooter? And he told him he was taking bad shots. But yeah, Jaylen's ability to get to a spot, lift up, and just be able to hit those clutch shots like we've seen throughout this postseason run. I'm so happy for the guy because he should have made all NBA. Like at some point, winning's got to matter a little bit. The Celtics are the only team in NBA history that has won 64 games and doesn't have 2 guys on the all NBA team unless you had the MVP. Like you go back in NBA history, the only teams that have won 64 plus and have had only one guy, it's Bird in 86, it's Magic in 87, it's Dirk in 07, it's Harden in 2018, and it's LeBron in 09. Okay, so Jason Tatum didn't finish in the top 5 in the MVP, and I'm not saying he should have, but doesn't that kind of tell you they probably deserved another guy on the All-NBA team? If we got teams that, I don't know, are playing in the play-in and they have 2 teams, and we got a Suns team that got swept in the first round and they got 2 guys on the All-NBA, so I'm happy for him because he's finally getting sort of the credit that he deserves, right? He's been under the radar throughout his career, sort of in Tatum's shadow. Not to say that he holds that against Tatum, but he's on the biggest stage and he's going to win Eastern Conference Finals MVP and NBA Finals MVP. It's insane.
Yeah, and that brings up an interesting point of the Jason Tatum part of this, right? Because the Jays go hand in hand. They're the Jays for a reason, right? Jaylen Brown, Jason Tatum, they go hand in hand when you're having a conversation about this Celtics team in this era of Celtics basketball. And so, I think it's funny the way that we're talking about how Jaylen has lived in Jason's shadow to a degree. And I think that's perfectly put. That's really what it's been. It's been, we know that Tatum is that guy or is potentially that guy, but then also Tatum has gotten stuck in this, top 5 discourse of he's enough to be the guy. He's criticized as if he's the guy, but then is constantly told he's not the guy. It's a very weird way that Tatum has been framed by the media. And so I know last night he was on I think it was the NBA TV set with Barkley and a few others, in a really interesting comment where he talked about, and I'm going to read it right here, where he said, early in your career, you get all the points in the stats, but then they say you haven't won. Now you're in a position to win a championship, and now you're not scoring enough. And that's exactly kind of where Tatum has been. And he's probably not going to get the finals MVP. I think maybe there's a small outside chance if he has a monster game 4 that he would take it away from Jaylen Brown. Very, very small chance. But this guy's about to average. Right now, he's at 22, 9, and 7 for all intents and purposes, rounding up a little bit here on some of those stats. Like, that's a really, really impressive stat line for a historic team that we're talking about that is up 3-0 in the NBA Finals. And Brian, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit here. I'm curious. Let's say Jaylen Brown does end up bringing home the Finals MVP, whether it's in 4 games, 5 games, whatever. What do you think becomes the next narrative or discourse around Jason Tatum? Because it, like I said, he's damned if he does, damned if he doesn't.
Yeah, well, it's just going to circle back to Jaylen's the better player. That's what's going to happen, because people aren't going to have the nuanced conversation about what Tatum's doing. Like, if you go back to Golden State's championship in 2015, Curry's numbers are not like out of this world great, and he doesn't win the Finals MVP because Andre Iguodala was doing the best job on LeBron, even though LeBron was going nuts as it pertains to like his raw numbers. So they give it to Andre Iguodala. But if you go back and you watch that series, they were blitzing Curry. So the team was playing 4-on-3 offensively. So if you look at it from that perspective, that is the value of having Curry. Like, their defensive game plan completely altered. And despite what Jason Kidd is saying, look at the actions. His actions on how they're defending Tatum tells you who he thinks the best player on the team is. Every time Tatum is blowing by his defender, he's getting double teamed, right? We're seeing 2-3 guys, and that's why the Celtics are getting all these open opportunities. But I guarantee that's what the dialogue is going to be, is that Jaylen's the better player, and nobody's going to look at the fact that, wait, who was covering him in the first round? Tyler Hero. And throughout this postseason run, Jason Tatum's been getting the tougher defensive matchups, if you will. And I would also look at the fact that he could have easily won the Eastern Conference Finals MVP if it wasn't for the splash. Like, he averaged more points than Jaylen, right? If it was the splash plays Jaylen had. Of course, he had the 40-point game. He had the huge 3 in game 1. And then in game 4, he made the critical plays down the stretch. The pass to Derek White and the block on Nembhard was just a phenomenal sequence there. And I think that Jaylen should have got it, but it was 5-4, right, in terms of the voting. So it was close enough. I think the problem is, like, people don't really know how to look at this team, and because it's not what we ordinarily see from a championship level team. In most cases, the championship level team has, or the championship winner has, a top 3 player in the league, right? And Jason Tatum, he's not a top 3 player in the league right now, right? He's close. He's on the verge of being a top 3 player, but I wouldn't take him over Jokic. I wouldn't take him over Giannis. Now, maybe we're going to have a conversation about Luka after the series, because defensively, this guy has just been an absolute joke. But I think he's 4 or 5 in the NBA right now, right? And especially after watching, like, the shooting struggles are real. Like, I mean, we can't ignore the numbers on that. But you think about it, how often has that happened in NBA history? You go back to probably the 14 Spurs when Kawhi wasn't Kawhi yet, and basically he was the guy defending LeBron. And then the 04 Pistons. Other than that, you go through NBA history, like Steph in 22, top 3 player. Jokic last year, the MVP. 2020, LeBron's still at that level. 2019, Kawhi Leonard's at that level. Golden State, whether it's Steph or, well, they probably had 2, whether it's Steph or Durant, right? So it's just rare. And I think that's the beauty of the team, that they found sort of the perfect players to put around both Tatum and Brown, like the way that Derek White can make up for some of the issues they may have at times, where he can take on the playmaking role, and the job that he's done in terms of improving as a shooter. And then, I mean, I hate to say this, but you just have a way better version than Marcus Smart, that when he shoots, you're like, okay, yeah, this is going in. You know what I mean? So it's the perfect team around these guys. So I think that's why this team is just unique. But circling back to, as I continue to ramble here, is it'll be Jaylen's better than Tatum. That'll be the conversation, even though the people making these arguments, like Perk, didn't vote Jaylen Brown as an all-NBA player. So now Jaylen Brown, I don't know if Tatum has just like moved back, or Jaylen Brown has just gone over everybody that Perk had in this all-NBA first team. So if he's better than Tatum, that means he's the fifth best player in the NBA, according to Perk, by his own voting. So I don't know. Perk drives me crazy. I probably shouldn't talk about
Brian,
that.
you're asking Perkins and a lot of the national media to use logic, and that it's just seemingly impossible these days. They have to use nuance. Seemingly impossible these days. 2008 Finals MVP Paul Pierce averaged 21.8 points, 6.3 assists, 4.5 rebounds. And when you think about the comparisons between the 08 team and this team this year, it's very similar in that team didn't necessarily have a top 5 guy on that team, right? Like KG was just a little bit outside of that. His defensive impact, obviously huge. Ray Allen, not even close to a top 5 guy at that point. Paul Pierce is top 10, top 15 guy at that time. So, with Jason Tatum, I think the discourse around him, it's stupid. Like Brian, you brought up earlier, he's guarding centers. The value in your superstar wing to be able to guard centers to negate the one main weapon that bends defenses for this Mavericks team is huge. You can't put a value on that because he's been 6'8" guarding 7 feet for all of these games in the postseason. He's guarding Evan Mobley in the Cavs series, right? He's guarding Miles Turner at points in the last series. Jason Tatum's value is on both sides of the court. And you mentioned Luka Doncic, and I do think we have to talk about Luka because it drives me personally crazy when people put Luka as like a top 2 player in the world. I'm a former basketball coach, varsity basketball coach. I value defense, and I just don't see Luka Doncic giving any positive impact on the defensive side of the ball. I think he's been the worst. I'm not going to go windy here, but I think he's been pretty goddamn bad on the defensive side of the ball. The blow by stats are insane. He's getting blown by more than anybody in NBA Finals history. And when you compound that with not being able to put the superhero cape on the offensive side of the ball, I mean, I would pick Tatum over Luka. I really would. I might even pick Jalen over Luka when Jalen's playing like this. But Luka Doncic, Brian, what are you seeing out of him right now on the defensive side of the ball? Because to me, I see a guy that doesn't want to be on that side.
Yeah, well, everybody talks about, he's dealing with a knee issue. He's dealing with an ankle injury. Now he's dealing with whatever a thorax injury is. He's getting shot up before these games like a football player. The one thing that I would counter with that is, okay, he's got all these injuries going on. Well, that's not affecting, like he's doing everything on offense, right? Like he has the ball constantly. He's running everything for them offensively. So why are we giving him an excuse on the defensive end of the floor? And that's why I go back to the David Ortiz thing in the Minnesota series. Like they never went at him. He was basically a DH. So when you look at Luka, at some point you got to be embarrassed. Like they're just like, I know that at times Luka's calling up guys and going at him. He was asked after the game last night about, essentially, to paraphrase, being the guy being hunted. And he was like upset with the question. But you look at the Celtics, they're constantly going at this guy. And what's happening, it's like a boxing match, right? Where he is worn down in the fourth quarter. He has 8 points in the entire fourth quarter of this series. He's tied for 7th in fourth quarter scoring. And I know he fouled out of this game, and I know game 1, they took them out with 5 minutes left. But he's not doing anything for them in the fourth quarter as it pertains to his scoring. His shooting numbers have gone into the gutter. It's sort of like, I don't want to say he's unprofessional because he finished in, 3rd or 4th in the MVP, but he's out of shape. I mean, the guy's literally out of shape for an NBA player. And I know, like, you can look at Jokic, but Jokic's stamina is ridiculous. I mean, this guy, he is in incredible shape, right? I do think we should maybe send Wemby a ring because I think that was probably the toughest matchup for the Celtics, the Jokic matchup. And Wemby, of course, beat him that last Friday of the regular season. And then they got the 2 seeds, so they had to play Minnesota, their toughest matchup on paper, right? But with Luka, I think he's embarrassed himself in this series. And I wouldn't have said that after the first 2 games, even with the defensive numbers being what they were and the Celtics targeting him. Last night was a joke. The fouls that he was committing, he had one. Who was it on? Al Horford, like a frustration foul on the other side of the court. It's like, what are you doing?
On Derek White, and then he had the foul on Pritchard where he's like, "I'm guarding Pritchard." He went Obi Toppin on him. He guarded Pritchard 94 feet, and he fouled Pritchard at half court. It's like, what are you doing, bro? I almost wanted the Celtics when he picked up Pritchard just to ISO Luka. That would have been the ultimate disrespect if they had just cleared out for Pritchard to take Luka.
I mean, with these fouls, real quick, one of the crazy parts is, I didn't realize this until after the game, he started the fourth quarter with 2 fouls. He committed 4 fouls, and he fouled out with, 4:12 left? In less than 8 minutes, he committed 4 fouls. That's insane.
Well, and I know Windhorst pointed this out, but so now with your 5th foul, you're trying to take a charge. And I was thinking to myself, if they, and I may have tweeted it too. I'm thinking like, are they really going to overturn this? Because if you watch, JJ Redick's like trying to make an argument that they should overturn
I don't think he
it.
even
Like,
believed it. We talked about
yeah,
this
I'm like,
last night.
dude, what are
It
you
was so
watching, man?
unclear.
Yeah, he's like on slow motion. I'm like, yeah, no, not on slow motion, not on anything. Like this is definitely a foul. He's yelling at the bench too to basically to challenge certain calls. And I understand why if you're Jason Kidd, you have to do it at that point because you need him in the game. But he's costing his team on that end. Like even like going back to remember when the Cavs used to hunt Curry. It was because like that was the worst or that was the best option for them to go after.
Right.
But Curry, by the way, Curry's not a bad defender, especially now.
Underrated.
He's not a bad. He's a little older now, but especially going back to 2022, it's not like the Celtics took advantage of him that much. He's 6'3", he's strong, he tries. Like he's at least like when they're trying to go at him, he's showing, he's getting back. Luka, there's no effort on that side of the ball. I don't know if it's one of these things where he's either just so tired because, as we mentioned, he's out of shape, or it just he feels like, hey, I'm doing all the offensive stuff. I don't have to do the defensive stuff. It's just, I mean. I agree with Windhorst that last night I thought that was an embarrassing performance, and he couldn't even really get it going when they were making that comeback. He had some struggles too. Like that was a lot of Kyrie that got it going there.
Yeah, I mean, as you're talking, Brian, it's really making me think of another MVP candidate or another MVP that the Celtics have dominated, who has the same problems against the Celtics year over year, running out of stamina, running out in the fourth quarter. Does it sound a little bit like Joel Embiid to anybody? This is literally the same guy that we're 3-0 against in his time in Philadelphia, and it's the same style on repeat. And it's a lot of these same things. Now, obviously, he's a much different defensive presence than Luka Doncic, but we attack him. We have the guys that match up with him, much like how Jalen takes on the Luka matchup. That's what Al Horford has always been to, counter Joel Embiid, minus that one time Al Horford played for Philadelphia, which we can kind of, forget about. Like that weird season never happened because we still won that series even with Embiid. And so it's funny thinking about those two and how, once again, kind of coming back to that Tatum conversation, who are two guys that are almost just guarantees to be ahead of Tatum in every, ranking of a player. It's going to be Embiid and it's going to be Luka, yet the Celtics have done the same thing to both of them, kind of wearing them down throughout series. And I don't know. I hope at some point that starts to matter in these conversations. And something that I've been thinking about, Brian, a lot is that one of the every playoffs you hear somebody say, best player in the series usually wins. Well, Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown win a whole hell of a lot of the series, and despite nobody picking them as the best player against Giannis, against Joel Embiid, sometimes against Jimmy Butler, against Luka, against Kevin Durant, they've beaten all these guys multiple times, and I would think, and we'll see, that a championship will hopefully start to change that narrative and that discussion, at least anyways.
Yeah, and Embiid, remember that game 7, they just went at him. They scored more points on him as the primary defender than he scored points on the other end. It was just, I thought it took them, quite frankly, and I don't want to criticize Mazzulla because I've given him a lot of praise. I'm all in with Joe Mazzulla, but it took them too long to get to that high pick and roll where they were just like calling up Embiid, and Tatum's like, all right, I'm going to knock down a bunch of threes. But I do think, like, now that I think about it with Tatum, he doesn't really have any weaknesses. Like, I know that his pull-up shooting has not been great throughout this postseason run, but he's one of the easiest guys to sort of build a team around because, okay, he can't do all the stuff that Luka can do offensively, right? But do you want to build your team that way, where one guy is dominating the ball that much, and we know that Luka can be a liability on the defensive end? To your point about Embiid, you can take advantage with him on the other side of the court as well. And with Tatum, he's an elite defender. What Greg was saying earlier, like, this guy he's guarding centers, but he's also playing point guard. He's a forward, and he's playing two different positions in the game, right? He's playing point guard on offense, and he's playing center on defense, which is just sort of remarkable to think about. So that does have to matter because you can't – I know Luka's got to him a little bit, but he's a really good defensive player. He now has really improved as a playmaker. We know that he can score over 30 points per game. He did it last season. He's an elite scorer. There's really no weaknesses. So even if he is never going to be, which he probably won't be, the offensive player that Steph Curry has been, or the operator with the ball that LeBron has ever been, it's really tough to look at him and say, like, who wouldn't want this guy on your team? And that's when you look at some of the other guys that are so offensively driven, so to speak, where it's like, which guy would you rather have? I can see the argument for Tatum because it's easy to build the team around him, right? Like you can put him on any team in the NBA and Tatum's going to be an absolute star because he's so, you don't have to alter your offense for him. I mean, the Celtics offense is totally different this year than even the way that it was last year, right? And I know the same concept, taking a bunch of threes, but Tatum plays so many different roles for this team. Like his pick and roll numbers in the postseason have been really good too. So I think that is a really good argument for Tatum, that he's sort of system proof, right? Where it's like, like this guy's perfect. He's exactly like, this team is what the Clippers were supposed to be, right? When they got Kawhi and Paul George, and everybody praised the Clippers because they got these two guys. And I thought it was a good move too. It's like, all right, you get two of the best, 5 wings in the NBA. It makes a lot of sense. Tatum and Jalen are literally doing this. They're about to win a championship, being two of the best wings in the NBA. And we had conversations for years about whether these guys fit together. And I think we're seeing like the benefit of having two of these guys. If you don't have that unbelievable dominant offensive player, this is probably the way to go. And I know it's tough to duplicate it, and you can't find just Derek White and Drew Holiday, right? I don't know why Milwaukee didn't get a third team involved. I mean, maybe that was a Portland thing. Maybe Portland didn't enable them to do that. But I mean, I don't know what fan base feels the worst right now. Is it Milwaukee? Is it Philly? They could have had Jalen, or they could have had Jason Tatum, right?
Was that tweet from Embiid real? Or did somebody?
Yeah, no, that was a real tweet.
It was a real tweet.
Yeah.
I mean, if Embiid's feeling that way, Philly fans are feeling great. But I think the Bucks fans got to be the most down bad. It didn't like hearing, if I'm a Bucks fan and I hear Doc on Bill's pod today, right, it got to drive me freaking insane. When you hear Dame Lillard say that he was just not in shape the entire season and Doc's just like spilling all these secrets, I would be so mad if I was a Bucks fan at this point, man. But you talked about, would we choose Tatum over Luka? One of the conversations that I keep coming back to, Will and I have talked about this a little bit, and Will, I'll kick it to you. Jaylen Brown and Team USA, man. Like Team USA has to be thinking to themselves, how do we get Jaylen Brown onto this squad? When you think about the versatility that he's shown and the poise that he's shown in these finals, him, Drew Holiday, and Jason Tatum, just the continuity that they have, bringing them all to the Olympics, I think would be really special. Where are you at, Will, right now with the idea of maybe Jalen being an injury replacement for Joel Embiid or for Kawhi Leonard?
I mean, I love the idea of it. And I think when you watch him match up with Luka, who we'll see what all these injuries do for Luka's availability.
I'll tell you what, Will, Devin Booker is not shutting down Luka Doncic in the Olympics.
That's a very fair point. That's a very, very fair point. I mean, I think it makes a lot of sense. I think as a Celtics fan, I'm like, all right, I don't know if we need a whole fourth of this Celtics team immediately going to the Olympics. So selfishly, a little bit of reservations. And I mean, if you think about it, I'm pretty sure, and I haven't looked this up, but I don't even think he made the final pool of people that they were choosing the roster from. So I don't even know. I mean, I'm sure it's Team USA. There's not really strict rules. If Grant Hill decided he wanted to just say, yeah, Jaylen Brown, we're taking you as a replacement for Kawhi or for Embiid, he probably could. And I think it makes a lot of sense. I probably don't see it happening at this point because he wasn't in that pool. But Brian, I know you even tweeted this out last night as well. Like, this has to be something when you think about if you're going up against Luka, or you're going up against, even maybe Franz Wagner and, in Germany and, there's a bunch of guys that you're thinking about where it's like, you know what, this Jaylen Brown, who, has prided himself this year, as we talked about, wanted to really be all NBA defense, didn't quite make it, got votes, was in the discussion for it. It probably hurt him that he had two other teammates that were going to make it. And so there's only 10 spots. It's, a little tough to get 30% of that from one team, but you've seen his play defensively. You talked about the big block in the Indiana series. Everything he's done here has to be leaving an impression that I think Team USA, if they could do it over again, would at the very least have him in the pool of players being selected.
Yeah, and I can understand at that point why they didn't really have him as like one of the top guys. But after watching this, it's like I almost feel bad for Jaylen because that whole thing where Stephen A. Smith basically read a tweet from one source that he has this better than you attitude, which I thought that was completely unfair. It's like, okay, so one guy in the NBA texted you and you're reading this to a national audience. And Jaylen handled that perfectly well. But I think he's going to be the Eastern Conference Finals MVP and the Finals MVP, and he's not going to be on the Olympic team. And I understand that these guys are huge in terms of their marketability, but LeBron's been on a bunch of teams, and I know you're not going to take LeBron off, but Durant, right. Kawhi is the one to me, and Embiid shouldn't play. If you're a Sixers fan, I would be incredibly upset if Embiid plays. And I would say the same thing. I don't know how many Clippers fans there actually are, but Kawhi can't finish a
We're going to find out
postseason.
how many people want to go to that wall, which is supposed to be
I know.
all Clippers fans. I don't know what that's going to look like.
Well, they got 1 million bathrooms, so I mean, they'll be good there. But so I just think that if there is, and there probably is, like, I don't think Kawhi should play. I mean, you just signed an extension, and I know, like, I do understand the point about, hey, we have Drew, Tatum, and Jalen there, like that. Like, that's a lot of basketball for all those guys after hopefully, knock on wood, finishing this off on Friday night and getting banner number 18. But I think it would be cool for those 3 guys, right, to have Drew, Tatum, and Jalen there together, and them to sort of be the guys there, where it's like, yeah, we just won the championship, and the rest of the teams like, oh yeah, Devin Booker, you lost in the first round along with Kevin Durant. LeBron, your team stinks now, and you're 40. All that team's concerned about is trying to figure out who can develop your kid, which I think is a totally different conversation and ridiculous. But like Jalen deserves to be on this team at this point. So if there is an injury replacement and it's not Jalen, I think that would be incredibly dumb by Grant Hill in this group. By the way, on Grant Hill, the guy's obviously has had a great basketball life, and I give him a lot of credit. Like, obviously came back from all those injuries. Can we get him off these broadcasts? Because he won't criticize anybody. And I think it's because he is the head of USA Basketball. If you notice, like, one of the only guys he has criticized is Luka, which he deserved to be criticized at the time, but he doesn't criticize anybody because I think he's afraid, like, these guys could be on the team.
Yeah, if you look at Team USA's roster right now, there's 3 guys. Well, Embiid obviously is injury prone, had an injury this year. Kawhi, same idea. And then Halliburton, you know, the fact that he's on the roster to me is a little bit crazy. Like, I think there's a lot of younger point guards that should at least be in the discussion as well. And then when you look at Kyrie Irving, I don't know if Team USA would ever put Kyrie Irving on it, but just in terms of like the continuity on that team, if you have Jaylen Brown and Kyrie instead of Tyrese and Kawhi, like, to me, that's a better team. And I think that all the guys on Team USA would welcome that with open arms. But yeah, man, I think Jalen, I think he deserves to be on Team USA, man. I've been saying this since they announced that roster, that it's crazy he wasn't even involved in it. And I truly think, you know, when you think about the two-way impact and how you need to be able to be super physical in the FIBA game, Jalen is tailor-made for that, and his ability to handle physicality. I talked about how when they initially left him off, Will and I were kind of going back and forth about this, that Jalen, when he first played on Team USA back in what I forget what year it was, he was playing the 4 a lot. He was guarding bigger guys, and they really gave him the opportunity to show that he could guard up. And that was the first time I really realized how strong Jaylen Brown is. And he's continued to just pack on the muscle that we talked about earlier in the pod. But yeah, man, it's pretty crazy that Jalen's not on it, and that everyone is kind of just accepted Devin Booker is better than Jaylen Brown. Like, yeah, he's a better scorer, but is he a better two-way player? Same thing we're talking about with Tatum and Luka. And when you think about the 92 Dream Team and the passing of the torch that happened on that team with Magic and Larry to Michael, like, something like that could happen on this Team USA team this year if they sent Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown with Drew Holiday. As you know, who knows who earns the minutes? That's going to be fascinating with Team USA to see who's in the crunch time 5.
Well, Tatum should start over Durant, but I don't think it'll happen because he's Kevin Durant, right? Like, Tatum will probably, like he's been in the past, be like that 6th man coming off the bench. But Tatum is the best rebounder on the team that's not a center. I mean, that's one of the most underrated things about Tatum's career, right? It's already been 3 times he's averaged over 10 rebounds per game in the postseason. He's an unbelievable defender too. Like, so, and even Tatum, like, he took on the Shea matchup earlier this season against OKC. But now that I think about it, what if Drew gave his spot to Jalen? He said, hey, I'm not going to play on the team, but the only guy that can take it is Jalen. Because from a Celtics fan's perspective, as somebody that wants to see this team continue to win, Drew Holiday, what did he turn yesterday? 34? Wasn't his 34-year-old birthday?
Yeah, he's our age now. He should be on the podcast with us.
He just signed for $134. I think the Celtics would be perfectly happy if Drew didn't go and he gave his spot to Jalen. So Jalen could play and could have Drew take the summer off, because Drew's played a lot of basketball over the past couple of years.
Yeah, I love that idea. I think that'd be great if Drew Holiday made that, you know, but like you said, it absolutely can only be Jaylen Brown. Otherwise, I'm still going to Paris. I think that'd be pretty fascinating if they were to put him put Team USA into that spot. I want to bring this back to game 4 here, because I don't want to keep you too much longer here, Brian. But I want to look at this game 4 coming up here on Friday. And I think so far, you know, in this series, the way that I can kind of look at it, and you can nitpick here and there, but like game 1, that KP run in the first quarter kind of defined that moment. And this is really leaning into the Celtics being a team, right? The team effort. That's everything comes back to how good this team is. And yes, it's led by the Jays, but KP has that big moment in game 1. Game 2, it belongs to Drew Holiday. We called it the Drew Holiday game here, doing our post-game recap. I think Drew was a standout in that performance. Last night in game 3, it felt like the Jays game, 30 for 30. That was kind of a classic Jays almost throwback moment, 30 for 30. Love seeing that and seeing them really dominate the first and second half and being able to kind of go back and forth with the ebb and flow of the game as to who was dominating the ball and who was making plays on both sides. So as we look to game 4, I'm curious, and Greg, I want to get your take on this, but we'll start with Brian. Looking at game 4, it's been somebody new every game that's been the quote unquote standout for that game. Is it a Derek White game? Is it an Al Horford game? Do we think the Jays are the one that close it out? Who would you lean to and give us a little prediction of who you think maybe is the standout come game 4?
I think Tatum and Jalen are both going to play really well, but you mentioned Derek White. I think this could be the game where Derek White just goes off shooting threes, because we've seen it throughout this postseason run. He's had games where he's hit 7, he's hit 8. And the thing is, you look at all these games, he's getting the volume, right? Like early on in that game last night, he had a shot that was not even close. And then when the game's on the line, Drew makes this unbelievable left-handed pass to Derek White. And did anybody think that shot was not going in? Every Celtics fan knew that shot was going in because he's been so good in the fourth quarter all series long. So I'll go with Derek White. I expect Jalen and Tatum to play well. I think Derek White could have a huge game shooting where it's like, oh, Derek White has 5 threes in the first half, and the Celtics are going to halftime with a 15, 16-point lead, and the Mavericks have quit.
He's getting so many wide open threes, man. In that first quarter, he was 0 for 4 from 3 last night. He ended up 4 for 5 in his final 5 3-point attempts, 4 for 9 for the game. But his first 3 attempts were right on the money. He was wide open, in and out, straight as an arrow, just hit the back rim or front rim. And then that fourth shot was that air ball when he tried to shoot Hunt in the switch pocket on the top left wing there. But I think that's a really good call. Derek White, the shot looks great. He's wide open every single play. He's being guarded by Kyrie as a primary matchup for the most part. They're selling out to stop the Jays. I think this is a Derek White game. I would totally agree with that. I'm excited to be in the building, Will. We're driving up tomorrow. My fiance, Brian, we're having a baby in 3 weeks. So July 3rd is the due date.
Congrats, man.
Thank you. Initially, I wasn't going to be able to go, but we had an appointment today with the doctor, and the doctor was like, it looks like it's going to be a couple weeks. And I was like, hey, babe, let's do it. Let's do it. The prices drop. They drop from like 1,200 get in down to like 500 get in. Yeah. So we're going to be in the building. I'm super excited. But how about you, Will? How are you feeling about tomorrow's game?
I mean, I love what you guys are saying about Derek White, because Derek White's been consistent in this series, right? Like he's getting a ton of open threes. He's shooting 9 a game. And it's funny, Brian, you talked about he missed one of them horribly. I thought back to game 2, he also had one where he was wide open and was completely off to the right side. And I caught that one as I was going through Luka's defense, because he was credited with, guarding Derek White on that shot when he was, I don't know, maybe 5-6 feet away. And so I do think Derek White is probably the logical call, especially given just the season that he's had, the push for the All-Star nod, being all NBA defense. But there's a part of me, man, I kind of just want to see one more throwback Al game. Al's played the second most playoff games of all time, minus Karl Malone, without winning a ring. And so to go out with a guy that you can, everyone's talked about the respect that Al has. Al was here, he left, but he's been and came back, but he's been here for the majority of the Jays since they came to the Celtics. He's been here through all the changes. He really feels like a true Celtic, despite he had an entire career with the Hawks before this. And so if Al Horford were to have a big night, he's always been a big fan favorite of mine. Even though it was funny, and this actually transitions into the last question that I wanted to ask you before we get you out of here, is I've told the story before. Greg and I living down here in Austin, when the Celtics first signed Al Horford, we were completely removed from really listening to sports talk radio in Boston. And so we're just watching the games. We lived together at the time. So we're just watching the games together, and we're like, man, I love Al Horford. Look at these screens he sets. Look at the way he communicates on defense. He's averaging like 15 and 10 or something. I can't remember exactly what his stats were. And I remember we happened to be back in Boston for that first round against the Bulls, in which Celtics actually went down 2-0, I think, as either a 1 seed or a 2 seed. And, came back, and I had no idea about the Lou Merlone versus Al Horford, average Al, all this other bullshit. And I remember we had some good friends of ours who were like, yeah, dude, like, what is the deal with Al? And I was like, you guys too? You guys are sucked into this trap that Al Horford, it was JD Drew all over again, that they gave him a contract. There were these blown out of proportion expectations. And, and Al from that time on, I think obviously Boston has warmed up to him. And so I think for him to perform with one of those classic playoff Al throwback games would be an amazing way to close it out. So part of me is sentimentally wanting Al to be the guy that has the moment. But quickly, on Boston Sports Radio, I'm just curious, Brian. I want to get your perspective on this. What's it like for you going from the daily sports radio? I know you worked in a couple different avenues with WEEI. I grew up as a sports radio junkie. It's why Greg and I, part of why I do what we do right now, is I used to be the kid when we're about the same age. So, I'd be 17, 18, working in the summer internship that I hated, and I'd get a half-hour lunch break. I'd go out in the parking lot and turn on my, 1996 RAV4, fire it up with like a snack, and just sit there in the blazing hot sun and try to catch whatever half-hour snippet of EEI or Sports Hub that I could. And, I'm really curious for you, what's it been like with that transition from the daily radio, which leads to a lot of, honestly, sometimes things I think they're just saying to say because they got to fill airtime, versus now I think you have a little bit more leeway to really have some more meaningful opportunities with your podcast schedule. So I'm curious to know what have those differences been like for you professionally?
Yeah, well, first I'll say my guy Lou Merlone. That's my guy. He told me he said that he's still getting stuff about the Al Horford stuff. Lou's the man though. He's outstanding too. He's doing the Nesson broadcast too, but. Yeah, in terms of transitioning, and by the way, just real quick on Al, if he wins this, he has a Hall of Fame case because it's the Basketball Hall of Fame, right? It's not the NBA Hall of Fame. Right. He has 2 national championships, and he did a back-to-back. We haven't seen that. Like, UConn just did it. The last time we saw it was when Al Horford was in college. It's crazy to think that Al was playing against the 08 Celtics,
dude,
which is just...
I was about to say that. He was on that. He was a rookie on that Hawks team. It's insane.
Yeah, it's crazy. But the thing I appreciate, like, going from radio, and I loved my time doing like Red Sox pre and post game, especially after games where people are so mad about something that happened in the game, and just like interacting with all the callers. But I think in like the podcast form, you can have like deeper, smarter conversations, right? Where it's like you have your time to explain certain things and back it up, whether it's with numbers or whether it's with, hey, they were doing this on this. So I think that's the biggest difference, where sports talk radio is more like, hey, here's the hook. And this is like the Jalen Tatum stuff is like catnip. Like, does Tatum have to play better? And I'm like, I'm not interested in that conversation because the Celtics are up 2-0. But I understand in like a radio situation why you have to have that argument, right? Like, but to me, it's not a really compelling argument at this particular point in time. So I like that you can have like, I don't want to say smarter conversations, but things that I personally care more about than like this guy versus that guy. Should they fire this? Like, I like having like more interesting conversations. And like with guests, you can have guests on for 40, 45 an hour if you want, right? Like I've had Alex Core on the pod a bunch, and we get to talk for 35, 40 minutes. And I interviewed him before, like when I was filling in on one of the shows there. And it's like, it's only a 15-minute interview. And with podcasts, it's more like a conversation than like an interview where it's like, hey, this guy's out of the lineup today, right? Or, hey, what do you make about what John Henry just said about you have a 1 in 30 chance at winning a championship? Like you just get either. And look, you need to ask those questions, right? But I just like having like more in-depth conversations, especially when you have interesting guests. I do have one question for you guys, though. And that is, now that we're talking about the 08 thing, what championship would mean more to you guys? Because to me, based on, and we're, as you guys said, we're around the same age, this one means a lot more to me than 08, because first of all, like we're covering this team, right? We're doing podcasts with this team. So we're like completely all in, watching every game and all that. Not that we weren't doing that in 08, but we certainly weren't doing that in like the podcast form. And the fact like podcasts were sort of not even like super popular at that particular point in time. But the reason I say that is that team, it was like, okay, Pierce had gone through a lot here in Boston, obviously, but it wasn't like he was ever close to winning a championship. I know he made it to the Eastern Conference Finals, but we all know that that was never a team that was going to win a championship. And Garnett and Ray had sort of had their battle scars. Ray got screwed by the NBA in 2001 because they won Allen Iverson in the finals, so the foul discrepancy was crazy. Garnett, I mean, that Minnesota team, they could never put the proper pieces around him. In 2004, he took that team to the conference finals. But I didn't have that pain as a fan of the Minnesota Timberwolves or the Seattle Supersonics or the Milwaukee Bucks. This team, we've seen every part of Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown's career. And look, Derek White came over in a trade, but those two guys together where we've seen the growing pains, the loss to the Heat in the bubble, and then the finals a couple of years ago, falling down 0-3 to Miami to almost pull off a historic comeback. And then Tatum rolls the ankle, to all the different changes with the coaching staff, even Brad Stevens, where I thought Brad was an unbelievable coach, but it felt like, all right, maybe the voice, it's stale at this particular point in time. Brad has done an outstanding job putting this team together and finding, like Ime before, we all know what happened there, but Ime was good for Tatum and Jaylen's development, where he's constantly calling those guys out and telling Tatum, hey, don't treat these guys as your friends. But just the fact that we've gotten all these losses through the years, and I say losses, this team is in the Eastern Conference Finals every year, okay? So I know a lot of fan bases are like, what are you talking about? But there's been a lot of calluses that these guys have built up together. So that's why, to me, this one would be so much more rewarding, because they went through this all together for a number of years. Garnett and Allen and Pierce, they won, and I know Pierce is here forever, but those guys won immediately. This group is like, we've been on this ride for now, 16, not that they were going to win in 16 or 17, but we've seen every part of these guys' maturation process in the NBA.
Yeah, man. I don't know if you saw this video essay that we did, but we'll play it for you here at the end. It's a couple minutes long, but our buddy wrote like a really good piece about being in our mid 30s and like kind of having the perspective now of watching this team as adults versus watching them as teenagers. You know, Will was just graduating high school when the Celtics won their last title. I was a freshman at BC. You were probably a sophomore. Where'd you go to college?
Syracuse.
Okay, so you're probably a sophomore at Syracuse at the time, right? And to me, it's just like the perspective of being an adult and just knowing how few and far between these championships can be, and just appreciating, like, you know, when we saw the last one, we were 18 years old, 19 years old, looking at these guys in their 30s winning a title. Now we're the guys in the 30s looking at these younger guys in their 20s winning a title. And it's just really interesting, just like as a life perspective lesson, to see how my perspective has changed on this title. But I agree with your overall point that the battle scars that they've developed together, it would be so much more meaningful, especially when there's all the talk over the years of splitting up the Jays and all that bullshit. It's just really nice to see two guys that we literally watched come into Boston as kids, grow up into young men, and now they're about to win this title. It's absolutely unbelievable. How about you, Will?
I mean, I think it's difficult to decide which one is more meaningful, because like this perspective of it is so different from each side of it. You know, you've seen everything, like you laid out perfectly, Brian. We've seen this team from the ground up, right? We've seen how everything transpired. We've felt all the losses that they felt. We have also felt in turn as fans. And, you know, this is kind of a little bit of a cherry on top, you know, with Mike Gorman going out in his last year. We had Mike Gorman on the podcast about halfway through the year. You know, Mike Gorman's from Dorchester, went to Boston Latin School, a guy that, you know, meant a whole lot to myself and Greg growing up. Winning it for him on the way out, like there's that added level to it. But then also I do still think back to 2008, and that team is, you know, I was trying to think of if you've ever seen the show like Westworld from back in the day. They have all the robots with like a cornerstone memory. Like that's a cornerstone for me, is that 2008 team, them winning that championship. Because, you know, I grew up, I played baseball more than I played basketball, and Red Sox were by far and away growing up. That was the end all be all. Pedro is probably still my favorite athlete of all time, is Pedro Martinez. And, you know, everything about the Red Sox was the end all be all. The Celtics, it meant a lot, but it didn't quite mean on that level of the Red Sox. And that 2008 team, for me personally, changed everything. The Red Sox, I still love the Red Sox, still love the Patriots, but the reason that I specifically just cover the Celtics with my best friend is because of that 2018. So they're both meaningful. It's just different perspectives. And I think obviously if you were to ask me this question, say Saturday morning, if they pull it off Friday and me and Greg are in the building for it, I may just say, fuck it, it's this one. It's the 2024 championship. I was there for it. It means a whole lot more. So I think that's a great question. And, the best part about it is I'm excited to find out what the answer is, because I think whether it's Friday or it's Monday, it feels like this is the year for this team, and we're going to find out what it feels like for the Celtics team to win a championship. Brian, you've been more than gracious with your time today, man. I really appreciate having you on today. This is a really fun conversation. What does it look like for you as from a coverage standpoint here going forward with the rest of the series, just so people can know when to tune into Off the Pike?
Yeah, I appreciate that. Well, we'll definitely be plotting after the game 4 on Friday night, and then TBD after that. I mean, I'll do a pod Sunday either way. It'll just be, hey, am I still talking about the Celtics winning a championship, or am I getting ready for game 5 on Monday night at the Garden? But I'll definitely be doing pods Friday and Sunday.
Awesome, man. Well, we'll make sure that, honestly, we won't be doing anything Friday after the game because we'll be in the building. So make sure you tune into Off the Pike to get all of your post-game recap. Brian, appreciate you joining us here. That's going to do it for this episode of Green with Envy. Greg, as always, any final thoughts? And then send us on out of here with some Black Sheep Optimists.
Well, we're going to play the video essay. So no final thoughts. We're going to play the video essay so that those of you that are tuning in, and Brian, that you can watch this well-written piece. It's gotten a lot of love. We doubled up our TikTok followers because of this video. So shout out to the TikTok nation. Shout out to Mark McDonough.
From 3 to 6, baby. We're coming for you. The TikTok money. It's coming soon. Here it is. Here's our video essay from the start of the series. Hashtag Celtics forever. Let's go.
When the Celtics won in 2008, I was 18, just out of high school. I watched the clinching game in a packed room full of people I would never speak to in any meaningful way again. But I didn't know that then. The whole world was in front of me, and the Celtics were champions of that world. And in the words of a former Celtic, anything was possible. I didn't realize that time moved so quickly. That next win never came. Everyone knows the story. The C's got close a few times, but no Auerbach cigars. There have been longer droughts, but I spent most of the years between 86 and 08 either having not been born yet or as a child. When the Celtics were bad, it didn't really matter. You could go get a discounted jersey at Marshall's and call it even. Now, I'm older. I've got a job and bills and aches and parts of my body that I never thought about before. There are happy things too. I mean, I'm getting married this fall. The version of me that saw Banner 17 seems distant, amorphous, unrelatable. He wanted the Celtics to win. I need them to. People will warn you about the dangers of investing too much of your emotions into a sports team. And they're probably right to do so. I mean, why would you love something that doesn't love you back? Well, I don't look at it that way. This is our community. These are our shared dreams. We care as teenagers, and we care at 34, and if all goes well, we'll care at 80.